Bank.
And out of that Palmetto State Bank account, how much money was ultimately dispersed?
If you could move it down a little bit. There we go. Looks like $387,029.93.
I'm not going to go through all of these payments that were made, but there's a cluster of payments here at the top: payment to loan, payment to loan, payment to loan. What are those, generally speaking?
Those are loans that were held at Palmetto State Bank that were under Alex's name, at least some of them in part, some of them in solely him.
And these items in parentheses, are those just sort of descriptors of those particular loans?
Yes, they're for my notes, so I could identify which loan number went to which loan.
And you specifically reviewed the loan documents in relation to each of these loans, correct?
Yes, sir.
So you're familiar with the supporting documentation for what they were collateralized by?
Yes.
So here at the top, we have a loan for Redbeard, correct?
That is correct.
And a payment on that in the amount of $47,000 some odd dollars.
Yes, sir.
And then for Zero United in the amount of $55,684 and some change. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And then a payment on a Moselle loan. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And how much was that one?
$65,238.92.
And then a payment on a GMC Yukon. How much was that payment?
$75,099.35.
And how much was paid on this Moselle note?
$104,056.51.
And then once again, as with before, in these yellow tables, you have the specific transactions that you traced using that first in, first out method, correct?
Yes, sir.
And is this the instrument that you traced?
Yes, sir.
I'm showing you a document labeled as States Exhibit 375. Do you recognize this document?
I do.
And what is it?
This is a tracing summary of a check from the Moss, Kuhn, and Fleming client trust account, roughly in the amount of $2.9 million.
And when was this instrument deposited?
That was May 15th, 2019.
And you indicated it was roughly $2.9 million?
Yes, sir.
And into what account was it deposited?
Into a Forge account ending in 7625.
And here we have a summary table of all the various expenses that $2.9 million funded. And the sum total, this first account appears to be the farm account. How much money was ultimately dispersed from the farm account?
$147,247.
And this next one would be for the checking account. Is that correct?
That is correct, ending in 6092.
And how much money, this one's a long one, so we have to flip over. How much money was ultimately dispersed from that checking account?
$1,429,753.
And this next one says 6649. Is that an additional account at Palmetto State Bank?
That is another checking account under the name of Alex MURDAUGH.
And how much was ultimately dispersed from that account?
$13,000.
And then here we have 6779 BOFA. Is that the checking account at Bank of America?
That is a personal checking account at Bank of America.
And how much was ultimately dispersed from that account?
If you scoot it up just a hair.
I keep looking down and you're looking up. My bad.
$1,208,449.89.
All right, and to identify just a handful of specific transactions or specific individuals who received some of this money, here we have a C.E. Smith. We actually have a variety of names here. In reviewing the instruments, did you see any sort of pattern of differentiation of checks all going to the same person?
I did. I saw it in different names. Just off the top of my head, it was over 10 different variations of that name.
Okay, but all of those different variations to your understanding and working with law enforcement, who is it your understanding all those checks refer to?
Curtis Edward Smith.
And so here we have a line that says C.E. Smith, and how much went out of this money to him?
So under the name C.E. Smith, $132,687.03.
And over how many instruments was that money effectuated?
24 different instruments.
And then a little bit further down, we have a Curtis E. Smith, and if I can read lines correctly, how much money was dispersed under that name?
$56,765.48.
And over how many instruments?
Your highlighter's covering it by 12.
And the next name down, Curtis Eddie Smith.
$6,404.
And that was a single instrument.
Yes, sir.
Curtis Edward Smith.
$4,725 over one instrument.
And Curtis Smith.
Curtis Smith, $23,823.03 over 4 different instruments.
We additionally had a payment to a credit card here in the amount of how much?
$7,570.50.
And did you ultimately get the records of that credit card?
I did.
Did you attempt to trace any further what specific purchases that money went to?
I did not. I just ended at the payment to the credit card for my own sanity, primarily.
And here we have Randolph Murdaugh III. How much money went to Mr. Murdaugh?
It was $385,000 in one instrument.
And then additionally, right below that, we have the name Scott Harriet. How much money went to Mr. Harriet?
$84 over one instrument.
Your Honor, we'll see if we can accelerate this process a little bit. Mr. Birney, I have handed you a series of exhibits starting with states 376 and ending in states 397. Do you recognize these documents?
I do.
And are all of these exhibits from 376 to 397 documents that you prepared tracing the flow of funds from instruments involving money going through the Forge account, through checks negotiated in the name of Palmetto State Bank, and from the Ferris fees from the Mack truck case?
Yes, sir.
And I think we actually already got through the Ferris fees from that truck case, so these would be what went through the Forge account, correct?
Through the Forge account, there's some Palmetto State Bank checks in there as well. In addition to, I believe there might be a check or two in the name of Alex MURDAUGH in there.
And throughout all of these tracings and all of these summaries, do they reflect that the money that Mr. MURDAUGH took went to his personal use and benefit?
They do.
And these are ordered in, roughly speaking, reverse chronological order, correct?
Correct.
Going from 2021 all the way back to a date of deposit on December 20th, 2011. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Your Honor, if I understood correctly after briefly conferring with counsel for the defendant, that they would be willing, for the purposes of this hearing, to stipulate to the admissibility of these documents for the court's in-camera review. Have I stated that correctly?
You have.
All right, so stipulated.
Your Honor, in the interest of time, I would present these documents to the court as admitted.
Provide the original to the court reporters and provide the court a copy of them.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, very good.
And that would be no further questions.
All right,
Sure.
all right, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
State ready for the jury, state and defense.
Your Honor, 1 moment, please. Now, Your Honor.
Okay, if you bring the jury. Participation, the jury will stand for a moment. Okay, if you bring the jury. Participation, the jury will stand for a moment.
Is present, sir.
Thank you. Be seated. All right, good morning. All right, welcome back. Day number 10. State's case, next witness.
State calls Tom Darnell.
Court in this trial shall be the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Take a seat in the witness stand. State your name again for the record. Spell your last name.
My name is Thomas Edward Darnell. Last name is spelled Darnell.
Good morning, Agent Darnell.
Good morning.
Could you tell the jurors where you work?
I am a fingerprint examiner at the State Law Enforcement Division, Forensic Crime Lab.
And how long have you been a fingerprint examiner for SLED?
Approximately 30 years.
Can you tell us some of your training, education that you've had?
Yes, ma'am. To begin with, I have a Bachelor of Science degree in Criminal Justice from the University of South Carolina, where I graduated in 1982. I started my employment with the Richland County Sheriff's Office in Columbia, where I was employed for about 8 years. I started my career at SLED in 1990 in the Late Print Crime Scene Department. During that time, I completed an in-house training program that dealt with all aspects of the fingerprint science. I've attended a number of courses across the state, as well as out-of-state courses that dealt with all areas of fingerprint science, to include how to process evidence for fingerprints and how to compare fingerprints. And I also trained under the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, in the same area of fingerprints. I've also trained other examiners to do the same job that I'm doing today.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move to qualify Agent Tom Darnell as an expert in fingerprint analysis.
Says defense.
No objection.
He's so qualified.
Thank you, Your Honor. All right, Agent Darnell, could you just kind of tell us in general about fingerprint evidence?
Well, basically, fingerprint evidence can be most anything. It can be items that are porous, items that are non-porous, items that come to SLED and where we get requested to process them to see if we can identify any fingerprints that might be on the surface. Fingerprints are primarily moisture. About 98% of the fingerprint that may be left on the surface is nothing more than moisture, perspiration, or sweat, if you want to call it sweat. And then once we determine the type of evidence that we have, then we try to develop it. We try to enhance any impressions that might be there. One thing to keep in mind is that in most cases, the fingerprints that we're trying to develop are invisible, basically. A latent print means just that, hidden or invisible. So it would require some enhancement.
And how, or what is the process of finding these hidden fingerprints?
Well, we have several different techniques that we can use, everything from super glue fuming to alternate light sources to fluorescent dye stains to different chemicals that we can use. There's also the black fingerprint powder, which is still being used. We don't use a whole lot of that in our laboratory today, but we tend to go with the fluorescent dye stains and the different light sources. It just depends on the type of evidence that we're trying to process.
And now you mentioned, was it, you say super glue fuming?
Yes, ma'am.
Could you describe how that works?
Super glue, what we do is we take the evidence, first of all, it has to be a non-porous surface.
And can you give us an example of a non-porous surface versus a porous surface?
Non-porous would be like a can, a gun, a cartridge case. Porous would be like paper. a paper cup, paper plate, a piece of, like a handwritten note or check or something like along that line. But the super glue is a commonly used process across the country, in fact, across the world. And the super glue is simply heated, and it creates a vapor or a fume, and that vapor will affix itself to any impressions that might be present on the surface. It enables us to see it better, and it also enables us to use a different technique or a different step of the process when it comes to trying to enhance the impression.
Okay, and when that print, I guess, is revealed in the fuming process, what do you do to analyze the print?
Well, once we get the print developed, we have it photographed. We have the luxury of having a photo studio within our laboratory, and we have a photographer that will document that for us photographically, so that we can then compare it to any known standards that we may be asked to compare it to.
So you would use the photograph for comparison purposes?
Yes, ma'am.
You don't do any kind of lifts of the print or anything like that?
I've done lots of lifts over my career with the black powder and the clear tape, which is what most of you are probably familiar with. But in this case, black powder was not used. I was working strictly off of a photograph.
So you did receive some items to test in this case for fingerprints?
I did.
I'm going to have you take a look at State's Exhibit 63, 64, 65, 66, 67, and 68. For those 300 blackout shell cases that you received to process for fingerprint evidence?
It is.
And did you find any evidence on those cases?
Actually, I did not. There was what we call, the result that I used with these items was that there was no fingerprint evidence was observed.
Would you expect to find fingerprint evidence on fired cases?
We don't find a lot of developed prints on cartridge cases. It does happen. We do find fingerprints on cartridge cases, but just not a great deal. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the cartridge cases they're exposed to heat, they're exposed to friction, and since fingerprints are so fragile, a lot of times that is probably a couple of reasons why we don't find a lot of prints on cartridge cases.
All right, did you also receive State's Exhibit 33 and 34 to test for or examine for fingerprint evidence?
I did.
Did you find any fingerprint evidence on those shot shells?
I did not.
And again, would you expect to find fingerprint evidence on items of that nature?
You know, we always make the attempt. Sometimes we're surprised when we process evidence that something will develop. I personally I've not had a lot of success with getting prints on shot shells. It's not to say that it hasn't happened.
And you said you've been doing this for about 30 years?
Yes, ma'am.
And in that time, have you ever found yourself a fingerprint on a fired case or shot shell?
I can't recall that I have developed anything that I can identify. I have developed ridge detail, or I have developed fingerprints on cartridge cases, but I can't recall honestly having a case where I was able to actually identify it.
Did you also receive a shotgun to check for fingerprint evidence?
I did.
That being State's Exhibit 4, a Benelli Super Black Eagle 3. Did you find any fingerprint evidence on that weapon?
I did not.
What else did you do with that weapon while you had it?
There was an additional request to have it swabbed for touch DNA, which I did. I swabbed various areas of the shotgun for DNA purposes.
And I will hand you State's Exhibit 307. Are those the swabs that you collected from that shotgun?
Yes, ma'am, it has the date that I collected it. It has my name and my initials and on the envelopes as well as on the seal.
Your Honor, at this time, we move tapes 307 into evidence. The swabs from the shotgun.
It says in the text.
I'm not sure which shotgun.
From the Benelli that was recovered at the scene.
MURDAUGH had.
Yes.
No objection.
It's admitted.
And do you recall where on that gun you collected those swabs?
Yes, ma'am.
Could you tell the jury?
If I could look at my notes real quick. I swabbed the trigger. I swabbed the rear stock, front stock, and the ejection lever on the shotgun. Yes, and that's the two areas that I swabbed.
And why would you have swabbed those particular areas?
Well, typically in a case involving guns, shotguns, pistols, we typically swab the trigger separately to possibly get a print on the trigger as who might have last had their finger on the trigger. And then we swab other areas of the gun that might be more conducive for touch DNA versus latent prints. Anytime we get something that we have a latent print request and a DNA request, we have to try to determine which area to swab, which area is typically handled by someone that might give us the best chance for any type of forensic evidence, whether it be DNA or latent prints.
And did you also swab the head stamps of those two shot shells?
Yes, I did.
And those swabs are in tapes 307 up there with the other swabs, is that correct?
That's correct.
Did you have an occasion to also examine Paul's cell phone?
I did.
I'm going to hand you tapes exhibit 309. Are those the swabs that you collected from Paul MURDAUGH's cell phone?
These are swabs that I took from a cell phone. I don't know for sure whose phone it was, but these are swabs that I took from the phone, which was my item 25.
And could you refer to your report to tell us what item 25 is listed as?
Item 25 is listed as a one iPhone, cell phone, black in color with a clear case.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move to admit tapes exhibit 309.
No objection.
It's admitted.
Did you also examine that cell phone for fingerprints?
I did.
Did you find any fingerprints on the phone?
I did not find anything that I could identify. I found a very small amount of fingerprint evidence on the phone. The result that I had to render was what we refer to as no value for comparison, which what that simply means is that there was the evidence of someone's fingers having come in contact with the phone. There just was not enough detail, not enough clarity for me to be able to compare it to anyone.
Do you recall examining some other shotguns or rifles in this case?
Yes, ma'am.
That would be a .300 blackout rifle, a Mossberg shotgun, a Browning shotgun, and another Benelli shotgun.
That's correct.
Did you find any fingerprints on any of those guns?
Nothing that I could identify. Again, the result of no value for comparison was the result that I reported.
And if a gun has a camouflaged print, for example, would that make it harder to find fingerprints on that weapon?
Well, not necessarily. We have some very bright lights that we would use to help us pick up anything that might be on a camouflage type surface. Keep in mind, we're spraying a fluorescent dye stain prior to using the light source, so that does help us see the prints much better. There are some areas on these shotguns that were like textured, which would not be very conducive to prints. But as far as the camouflage area, you know, it makes it a little harder to see, but we do have the means to be able to analyze it thoroughly.
And these items that we've been talking about, when you process them for fingerprint evidence, you use the super glue fuming method?
Yes, ma'am.
While you were processing those guns, did you collect swabs from each gun?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm going to hand you State's Exhibit 308, if you take a look at that.
Yes, ma'am. These are the envelopes that I placed the swabs from the shotguns. It's got my date and initials and where it came from on the shotgun.
Your Honor, at this time, the state removes State's Exhibit 308 into evidence.
Good.
Now, did you receive a 30-round magazine that was full of 300 blackout cartridges?
I did.
Did you test that item for fingerprint evidence?
I did.
Did you find any fingerprints on that magazine?
It was, again, as the shotguns, it was all no value for comparison.
What about each of the bullets that was in that magazine? Did you examine them in any way?
Yes, ma'am. I took each one of them out of the magazine and processed all of them individually.
Did you find any fingerprint evidence on those bullets?
No, ma'am, I did not.
And what did you do with these swabs that you collected?
Once I collect the swabs, I allow them to air dry, and then once I secure them into envelopes, I seal them, put my date, initials, and then I package them up accordingly, and they ultimately wind up with the DNA department. I believe in this case, I took them down to our evidence control department, and then DNA will pick them up from there.
All right. One moment, Darnell. No further questions from the state at this time. You'll answer any questions from the judge.
Please, Court, Your Honor. All these items were processed in the lab, is that correct?
That's correct, yes, sir.
And help me to understand this. You processed 3 shotguns.
I believe that was right, yes, sir.
You processed, were any of them loaded with shotgun shells?
I don't recall them being loaded.
So you did not process any of the, if they were loaded, you didn't process any of the shells in them?
Normally, when a weapon comes into the laboratory, it's cleared and unloaded prior to it getting to our laboratory. So, had they been unloaded, I would have or had they been loaded, they would have been unloaded prior to me receiving them, and I would have processed what had been inside the weapon at that time.
So the weapon we identified earlier as, let me put the glasses on here, as, I may left it on the table, I apologize. It's right here. Number 22, item number 22, the camo Benelli Super, I'm sorry, yeah, Benelli Super Black Eagle, the 2 unfired shotgun shells. You processed that at the lab?
Yes, sir.
Was the gun loaded when it came to you?
My notes do not indicate that it was loaded, and as I said, normally when a weapon, a shotgun, comes into the laboratory, it's unloaded prior to it coming to me. My notes indicate that it was not loaded.
And the other shotguns, I mean, I've looked at your analysis on them, that there were no fingerprints of evidentiary value on the 3 other shotguns, right?
That's correct.
But there's no indication that you processed, if they had been loaded and unloaded, any of those shotgun shells, correct?
That's correct. I only processed what was given, what was brought into the laboratory.
And you processed those on June 9th, is that correct?
That sounds right, yes, sir, June 9th.
Now, the cartridges, there's a bullet, and then there's a casing on a typical semi-automatic weapon. Were you ever asked to, you were asked to process the ejected cartridges that were involved in the murder, correct? The 308s? I mean, the
Yeah.
300 blackouts?
Yes, sir.
And those had been fired, and what you indicated that once a bullet or a shotgun shell had been fired, it heats up. Is that why you can't get a fingerprint off of it?
Well, that would be one possible explanation. Heat, friction, they're on the ground. You know, weather can have an effect sometimes if it's raining or if it's hot or cold. There are lots of things that could have an effect on whether or not a print would be left.
And I think your testimony is that if not rarely, never found fingerprints on an expended casing. Is that correct?
Well, I wouldn't say rarely, never. I know of cases in our laboratory that have been, where they have been able to identify prints on cartridge cases. It just doesn't happen very often, but it does happen.
Okay, but then you processed a number of, there was a magazine with a number of 300 blackout shells that had never been fired, correct?
Yes, sir.
Bullets, I'm sorry.
That's correct.
And that's a piece of brass, right?
Yes, sir.
I mean, is a piece of brass conducive to fingerprints?
Yes, sir. It can be, yes, sir.
Any evidence these bullets have been, the bullets have been wiped or something, or just, I mean, please explain to the jury why you would normally get fingerprints off of a piece of brass, a unspent bullet. Why is that?
Well, you got to keep in mind that a latent print is nothing more than, or mostly moisture. They're very fragile. It doesn't take much to wipe a print off of the surface. The cartridges I think that you're speaking of were in a magazine, so they've been shoved into a magazine, and then you got to get them out. So you got friction there going on, but most any surface that's smooth and fairly clean and not corrugated or textured can be conducive to prints. I have developed prints on cartridges before. It just doesn't happen very often.
But again, it's a brass surface, almost a polished brass surface. Did you say because it's mostly moisture, isn't there some oil involved in that from the fingers? Or am I wrong about that?
Well, you would have, as far as coming from your fingerprints, from the fingers, or
Well, I mean, the finger, it's always just moisture?
It's mostly 98 to 99% moisture. And then you might have some other substances mixed in there, but it's mostly just sweat is what's left behind.
You do retrieve fingerprints occasionally, do you not? You find fingerprints on things?
Oh, yes, sir. I've developed quite a few prints in my 30 years of doing this.
And once you develop a print, you can compare it based on how many points you have to do a comparison to make a match?
Well, there's no set number in this country where you have to have a certain minimum number of points. You just have to have a sufficient amount of clarity and to be able to determine that an impression was made by a certain individual.
Okay. Did you ever go to the scene of these murders?
No, sir, I did not.
You were not called out that night?
No, sir.
So the forensic folks that went out there, to your knowledge, did they throw any powder down? Did they do anything to find any fingerprints that night?
I honestly don't know. I did not look at their notes from their crime scene or what have you. I really had no real reason to. I was just asked to process the things that they brought me.
So let me ask you this. You've got a doorknob right here. Doorknob. I just grabbed it to open it. It's brass. Would that leave a fingerprint?
It's possible. You have to consider how much someone perspires when they touch something. You have to consider how soon after the doorknob was touched did someone else grab the doorknob, because a latent print is extremely fragile. It doesn't take much to obliterate a print.
But you would check. If you were on the scene, you'd look.
If I was on the scene and I felt like that area was accessed by someone, I probably would have checked, yes, sir.
I mean, it appeared that there had been a shotgun blast to the victim inside a room behind that door, and you didn't know whether the door was open or closed before that person was shepherded in there or walked in there, you would want to at least look at the knob, right?
Yes, sir. I probably would, but you know, I was not on this scene, so I don't really know exactly what all they had going on. So, but with your scenario that you're speaking of, yes, sir. I probably would have checked.
And you would expect to see notes somewhere from the crime scene folks that they looked at the doorknob. But you can't just eyeball it. Don't you have to put some powder on it, or don't you have to put something on it to raise the visibility of the fingerprint?
Well, yes, sir. In some cases, you can actually see a print if it's more of a what we call a patent print. A patent print is a print that might be left behind with a, you know, in a residue. Could be in grease, could be in blood, it could be in dirt, anything such as that. So, but ordinarily, when you go to look for prints, you've got to do some sort of processing to a surface, depending on the surface and depending on just what you're trying to do.
So if you had a relatively small room where somebody's head had exploded and blood and all kinds of bodily fluids were sprayed over the inside of that room, you would want to take a meticulous examination of that room to see if there are any fingerprints in blood or other bodily fluids, would you not? Would you?
I would, yes, sir.
And you would expect to see something in some report by the crime scene folks where they actually did such an examination, would you not? Would you expect to see notes detailing that they at least looked at it?
Yes, sir. I mean, you know, again, this is, you know, I wasn't at the scene. I can, but if you're describing this type of a scene, if it was me, I would take notes, you know, detailed notes, you know, because, you know, photographs, notes, sketches, all that kind of goes hand in hand.
But there should have been, well, strike that. You would also expect to see any surface that could have come into contact with perpetrator to have been processed, either photographed or processed in some way. You would expect to see that in the notes of the crime scene investigators, correct?
I would think in the notes or in their, you know, testimony or anything such as that, you know, there should be something to explain what was done, yes, sir.
Okay. Do you know if there was a fingerprint person or somebody that had those skills in the crime scene team that came out that night?
I don't know. I know that there was no one from the latent print department where I worked at the scene that day.
Do you go out to crime scenes? Do you go to crime scenes?
I've done plenty in my earlier days, but I have not been on crime scenes for quite some time.
You have people in your latent print unit that do go to crime scenes.
Not really. The latent print department, the way it was set up, we pretty much are in the laboratory setting, and we process evidence that comes in from crime scenes. We don't typically go to the crime scene.
And so I guess if I'm summarizing this, everything they had you look at, you looked at in the lab.
Yes, sir.
And you found no, when I say identifiable prints, it sounds to me like you found no evidence of any prints.
Well, I found anytime I report something as no value for comparison, that means that I did find evidence of fingerprints. It just wasn't enough to compare it to anyone. Anytime I say nothing was observed, that means there was nothing observed.
So I mean, I looked at all these, other than the, no value for comparison on the cell phone, that would mean you saw something, but you didn't have enough to compare.
Yes, sir, and, you know, it was no value. You know, keep in mind, again, their legs are fragile. You've got weather involved, you know, water, rain, that sort of thing certainly is detrimental to fingerprint evidence being left behind.
So other than the cell phone, everyone else says no fingerprint evidence was observed. That would mean there was nothing, not even a partial, right?
Yes, sir, anytime that result is in the report, that's what that means, yes, sir.
Other than the cell phone, you didn't even find any evidence of fingerprints, not a partial, not a smudge, not anything.
Well, I believe there were some additional long guns that came into me where I did get no value for comparison, but the initial shotgun that came into me was, nothing was observed, yes, sir.
And the initial shotgun would have been number 22.
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Would it surprise you to know that Mr. MURDAUGH was seen holding that shotgun, had actually retrieved it from his house, brought it down
Objection,
to the
Your
murder
Honor.
scene?
Counsel's testifying.
Response?
I'm just citing evidence that the state's already put into evidence. I'm not testifying to it, because these are facts that have been already established by the state. He's an expert. He can opine.
Pardon?
He's an expert, therefore he can give an opinion.
The objection's overruled.
Would it surprise you to know that Mr. MURDAUGH was seen that evening when first responders came, holding that shotgun, and the state has indicated, I mean, that's not in conflict, no one's challenging that, and yet there were no, I mean, you found no evidence of fingerprints, is that correct?
Right, yes, sir, and, you know, that's, you know, prints aren't always left on surfaces when you touch them. You know, just because you touch something does not mean you're going to leave a print, and there are all kind of variables as to why.
Would you agree with me you found no prints on any of the items you were asked to examine? Cartridge cases, fired, unfired, shotguns, the shells in the shotguns, you just found no prints whatsoever?
I found none of value for comparison, which tells me that there was something there, but it just wasn't of value to compare.
And it's only on the cell phone?
The cell phone and then the additional long guns that came into me later.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Beg the court's indulgence. Thank you, sir. No more questions.
Read that right.
Briefly, Your Honor. Agent Darnell, you were previously lieutenant of crime scene.
Yes, ma'am. I was actually promoted to lieutenant over the Lake Print Crime Scene Department in 1998, where I was in that role for about 6 years.
And in your experience in that position, are crime scene personnel trained to look for fingerprints at a crime scene?
Yes, ma'am. Back when I was a lieutenant over the crime scene department, we used to do the crime scene, we did the printing, we did everything. Now it's two separate departments. We have a lake print department and we have a crime scene department. The crime scene department, as I understand it, they are trained in how to process crime scenes, which would include how to process certain things on its own scene for fingerprints. In other words, if it was something that was large and not able to transport back to the laboratory, they do get some training in how to process for prints.
And with such a bloody scene, did you get any bloody prints in this case?
I was not submitted any bloody prints in this case.
Thank you. Nothing further from the staff.
Thank you.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you. You may step down.
Thanks, sir.
Call your next witness.
Take called Blake Johnson.
Put your left hand on the Bible, raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give to this court to be the whole truth, so help you God?
I do.
Okay, thank you. Have a seat on the witness stand. Repeat your name and spell your last name for the record.
Blake Johnson, last name, Johnsson.
Hi, Agent Johnson.
Hello.
Could you tell the jury where you work?
I work for the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division.
And how long have you been with SLED?
Been with SLED a little over 5 years.
And what are some of the duties of your position?
At SLED, I work for the investigative services in the Low Country region, and as part of that, I investigate crimes within the lower 12 counties, to include homicides, officer-involved shootings, cases such as that.
And with your involvement in the investigation of Paul and Maggie Murdaugh's murders, did you have a chance to collect some buccal swabs in that case?
I did.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 338 and State's Exhibit 339.
This one is a buccal swab that I took from Claude Rowe, CB Rowe. And
That State's Exhibit 338.
And this is a buccal swab that I took from Connor Cook.
Okay. And how do you know you took these two buccal swabs?
Because of the writing on the outside. This is that exterior envelope. If I open them, the one that I have side would be inside.
All right. And how did you collect these buccal swabs?
I was provided buccal swabs. They come two to a pack in a sterile pack. They're opened, and the inside between the cheek and gum of both subjects are swabbed. And they're put back in the envelope and sealed.
And sealed?
Yep.
Okay. They're sealed so nobody can tamper or alter those buccal swabs?
Yep. Evidence tape is placed on the seal, and it's signed and initialed, or initialed and dated.
Okay. Your Honor, at this time, the state removes State's Exhibit 338 and 339 into evidence.
No objection, Your Honor.
You're admitted.
And Your Honor, we have no further questions for Ms. Whit.
No questions.
Thank you. Now
Thank you,
step
Judge.
down. Your next witness.
Lawrence Wiggins.
Put your left hand on the Bible, raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give this court to be the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. You have a seat on the witness stand. Repeat your name and spell your last name for the record.
Lawrence Wiggins, Wiggins.
I believe it's Chief Wiggins now, is that correct?
That is correct.
Are you the chief of Allendale? Is it Sheriff's Office, Police Department?
Yes, so I'm currently employed as the chief of police for the town of Allendale.
But back in 2021, where were you employed?
I was employed with the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. I was assigned to the investigative services, and I worked out of the regional office in Walterboro.
And at that time, were you involved in the investigation of the deaths of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh?
I was preliminarily.
And did you have an occasion to collect some buccal swabs?
I did.
I'm going to hand you State's Exhibit 336 and 337. You could take a look at those and tell us what we have there.
We have buccal swabs taken from Mr. Roger Davis and Anthony Cook.
And you collected those swabs?
I did.
And how do you know you collected them?
my initials, and
I'll consent to the admission of these, rather than going through the process of how he identified them and collected them. Now, she's welcome to do that, but I'm just trying to save a little time here.
All right.
So, so state's exhibit 336 and 337. Into evidence. Well, Your Honor, we would have no further questions for this witness then.
No questions, Your Honor.
Thank you, sir.
The state would next call Chandler Horney.
Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give this court to be the truth, so help you God? Okay, have a seat on the witness stand. Please repeat your name and spell your last name for the record.
Hi, my name is Chandler Horney, Horney.
And Agent Horney, can you tell the jury who you work for?
I work for the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division.
Okay, and what is your position there?
I'm a special agent with the Vice Services Unit.
Okay. And were you involved in the murder investigation of Paul and Maggie Murdaugh?
I was.
And did you collect some buccal swabs or in this case?
I did.
Okay. I'm going to hand you State's Exhibit 340. You will tell us what those are.
These are the collected buccal swabs from Morgan Dowdy and Miley Altman.
And how were those collected?
They were actually collected by a coworker, Special Agent Anthony Sampson. In my presence, he took the swabs of the inside of both of these individuals' cheeks.
And then when he took the swabs, he placed them in,
This envelope.
and they were placed in bags that were sealed, not to be tampered with.
Yes, ma'am.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move State's Exhibit 340 into evidence.
No objection.
Submit it.
We have no further questions for this agent.
Sorry, Your Honor.
Any questions?
No, sir. Thank you.
Step down.
Thank you.
The state next calls Joe Moore. I'll be all day.
Do you swear from the testimony you're about to give this court to be the truth, so help you God? I do. Okay, have a seat on the witness stand. Please repeat your name and spell your last name for the record.
Jomar Albialde, spelling my last name is A-L-B as in Bravo, A-Y-A-L-D-E, Albialde. If it makes it any easier, my peers call me Joe.
Joe. Thank you, Joe. And you did tell me a little trick to pronouncing that last name there.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and what was that?
If you remember the phrase, "I'll be here all day," and drop the here, "I'll be all day," you got it.
And thank you so much for sharing that with me.
Yes, ma'am.
And you work for SLED, is that right?
I do.
Okay, and did you have the chance to collect some buccal swabs in the investigation of the murders of Paul and Maggie Murdaugh?
I did.
I'm going to hand you State's Exhibit 342, 343, and 344. So take a look, please.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and State's Exhibit 342 is a buccal swab you collected from who?
Thank you. All right, this Exhibit 342 is from Mr. Randy Murdaugh.
Okay, and then 343?
343 is a DNA sample collected from a Hippolito Torres.
And 344?
This final buccal sample was collected from his son, Alan Gonzalez.
And how did you collect these buccal swabs?
Yes, ma'am. These were collected via a DNA or buccal swab kit, which essentially is a swab, as a Special Agent Johnson explained to you earlier. So it's simply a swab from each side of the inner cheek, placed into a secured envelope, and then sealed in a evidence envelope, such as this one.
It would be sealed so it was not tampered with, is that right?
That's correct, ma'am.
Okay. At this time, this tape removes tapes 342, 343, and 344 into evidence.
It says the defense. Any objection?
No, sir.
Admitted without objection.
Thank you, Your Honor. State has no further questions for Joe. Thank you.
Cross-examination.
Thank you for the indulgence, one moment. No questions, Your Honor.
Thank you. You may step down.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, next.
All right, next witness is going to be fairly lengthy, and Mr. Fernandez is going to call him, and we'd ask for just a moment to get the exhibits out that he needs and get them in order so it moves orderly before the jury, if we could.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a brief break. Bring the jury. Thank you. You may call your next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I please report?
Yes, sir.
State calls Paul Greer.
Do you swear affirm the testimony you're about to give the court to be the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Okay, please have a seat in the witness stand, repeat your name, and spell your last name for the record.
My name is Paul Greer, Greer.
Paul, how are you doing today?
I'm great, thank you.
Take a moment to unpack your stuff if you need to. Paul, if you would, please introduce yourself to the jury and tell us a little bit when you graduated high school and where you went for education.
Sure. My name is Paul Greer. I am originally from the upstate of South Carolina, went to school and graduated high school in 2009. Upon graduating high school, I attended the University of South Carolina and received a Bachelor's of Science in Biological Sciences from the University of South Carolina.
Thank you, Paul. I'm going to ask you, if you would, to pull that microphone a little closer so we can all hear you.
Yes, sir.
No, thank you. All right, Paul, walk us through a little bit about your career. With whom are you currently employed?
I'm employed at the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, which is commonly known as SLED.
All right, and tell us a little bit about your professional career. How did you get started at SLED, and what is it that you do there?
Yes, sir. After completing my Bachelor of Science at USC, I began an internship at SLED in the Forensic Services Laboratory. I specifically did that internship with our Firearm and Toolmark department. I interned there for several months and ultimately achieved a position there in that unit. I began my employment officially at SLED in March of 2014 in the firearms, and training to become a firearms examiner.
All right, and are you currently employed as a firearms examiner with SLED?
Yes, sir.
All right, Paul, Mr. Greer, if you would, walk us through what that required in order to become a firearms examiner.
Sure. In order to become a firearms examiner, there's a lot of extensive training on the job that must be conducted. At SLED, I began an in-house training program that we refer to as the Firearm and Toolmark Course of Instruction. During this time, again, it was extensive, approximately 3 years or so. I assisted other examiners who were qualified on the job, prep their cases. I learned how to work those cases. I looked at thousands of fired ammunition components on the microscope and did many comparisons of those. During that time, I also completed multiple written and practical examinations. At the conclusion of that training program, I was given a comprehensive final exam that included some mock casework within our laboratory. I successfully completed all of that training in that mock casework and was able to begin working cases on my own.
In addition to the comprehensive qualifications and testing required to become a forensic examiner, are forensic examiners in SLED also subject to yearly testing as well?
Yes, sir. We do the competency at the conclusion of our training program. But we also participate in proficiency testing each year within an area in our discipline. So that is completed. I complete a proficiency test each year, and that just assures that we're maintaining our competency.
Thank you. Paul, are you a member of any professional organizations?
Yes, sir, I am.
And which one would that be?
I'm a member of the Association of Firearm and Toolmark Examiners, which is also known as AFTE.
Have you had any opportunity to attend additional trainings or conferences under the umbrella of firearms and toolmark examinations?
Yes, sir, I have.
Please explain a couple of those or a few of those, if you would.
Yes, sir. AFTE hosts an annual conference each year, and AFTE, I might add, is an international organization. It's a group of firearms and toolmark examiners around the world, as well as other scientists and members from the academic world. We get together each year, and I attend that when I'm able in order to share information and see what's happening within the field of firearm and toolmark examination. I've attended several of those conferences, and I've also attended some regional conferences that have been hosted by the FBI laboratory in Quantico.
And speaking of laboratory, is your laboratory accredited?
Yes, sir, it is.
And what is the accreditation it operates under?
The SLED laboratory is accredited under ANAB. That is a national organization that follows ISO 17025 standards, and those are international standards. So our laboratory is operating within the same set of standards as other labs in the United States that are accredited with ANAB, and also those who follow the ISO 17025.
And in order to maintain accreditation, is there an inspection process that ANAB requires?
Yes, sir.
All right, and explain, if you would, the couple of inspections that are typically required.
In order to maintain our accreditation, we have a visit approximately every 4 years. Auditors come in to the laboratory to check our casework, review our files, make sure that we're operating within those standards, and they watch us perform casework. That's a huge component, and they do this for all of the disciplines within the laboratory. And that audit every 4 years within that cycle helps to ensure that we're meeting those standards. Internally at SLED, we also have internal audits each year. So even though the ANAB inspectors that come every 4 years, we may not see them every year, there is some type of audit being performed within our departments and in our casework each year.
Thank you. Does the SLED laboratory operate under a policies and procedures guideline for the overall agency?
Yes, sir, we do.
All right, and explain a little bit about how that involves the lab.
Correct. SLED in general, a set of policies that we must adhere to. Within the laboratory, each department has a manual that they must follow that gives them information on how to conduct their everyday work and how to perform casework. Additionally, and following the ANAB accreditation, we have a SLED quality manual that is specifically for the laboratory. We follow that as well, and those are all guidelines to help us to conduct casework.
And in addition to the SLED quality assurance manual, would there additionally be a SLED firearms department manual that you have to comply with?
Yes, sir. There is a firearms manual that we must follow.
Okay. Just very briefly, please explain what that involves.
Yes, sir. That again is just a document that gives us information on how to conduct our day-to-day casework, what to do with evidence, how we should examine that. It also gives us information into our training program, any type of calibration or measurement references that we need to consult for our equipment that we use. All of that information is contained within that manual that we have to follow and can reference.
All right, and if you would, please explain to the jury what firearms identification, generally the subject matter, what that is.
Sure. Firearms identification is a discipline in forensic science where our main objective each day is to examine those fired ammunition components. So imagine a fired cartridge case or a fired bullet, and we're looking at those in order to determine if they were fired by a specific firearm.
Thank you. How long again have you been working in SLED, in the SLED laboratory?
I've been employed in the firearms department at SLED for almost 9 years.
And have you had an opportunity to testify in court such as this?
I have.
Would that be both state and federal courts?
I have testified in state and federal courts, yes, sir.
Approximately how many times, or do you know how many times?
Approximately 27 times, yes, sir.
Your Honor, at this point, state moves to admit Mr. Greer as a firearms and tool mark examination expert.
Your Honor, no objections to his qualifications.
He's so qualified.
Thank you, Your Honor. All right, Mr. Greer, I'd like to take the moment to kind of educate the jury a little bit on firearms.
Yes, sir.
And if you would, please tell us a little bit about the, well, first of all, are you familiar with the two kind of cartridge rounds we're going to primarily be talking about today?
Yes, sir.
And are you familiar with the two kind of firearms we're going to generally be talking about today?
Yes, sir, I am.
All right. If you would, please give us a little, an intro to firearms, beginning with perhaps the shotgun. Tell us what makes that a unique type of firearm and how it generally operates.
Yes, sir. In general, a firearm is a mechanism that propels a projectile through the combustion of gunpowder. As he was stating, there are several different types of firearms, and one of them is a shotgun. A shotgun, if you imagine, is a long gun, typically that is designed to be fired from the shoulder. And that has a smooth bore. And what the bore is, it's just the inside of that barrel, so there's no rifling inside that barrel typically. A shotgun is also different than maybe a handgun that you may be familiar with, and it fires shot shells. And a shot shell is a cartridge, if you will, that could be plastic or metal that can contain multiple projectiles or a single projectile.
When you said barrel, smooth bore, and rifling, would rifling mean sort of the interior of the barrel where the bullet exits is spiraled inside?
Correct. That rifling is in barrels. In order to give a bullet that's traveling down that barrel its rotary twist and spin so that way it can travel to a target or its destination.
And does that rifling assist in the bullet traveling in a straight line consistently?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the
The
question?
rifling, spinning the bullet, making it go out, does that allow it to travel in a straight line?
Yes, that rifling that's inserted into that barrel, if you'll think of kind of like a quarterback throwing a football, it helps it give it that nice spiral so that it can travel more efficiently.
And kind of the opposite of that would be the smooth bore of a shotgun. How does that affect the pellets or the BBs inside of the shotgun?
So in a typical shotgun, you don't have that rifling that gives it that spin or twist, but that's not the design of the shotgun. So when those pellets or a slug or whatever is traveling down the bore of that shotgun, it is just traveling out the barrel based on the combustion from it firing.
And if you would please describe to us what type of ammunition a shotgun will shoot.
Typically, you use a shot shell. That can be made of some type of plastic. Typically, we see that with some type of metal head on it. Inside that shot shell, there can be multiple projectiles. You hear of pellets. We think of birdshot, buckshot. That's what would be inside of a shot shell. Also in there may be other components. That could be plastic or some type of paper material, and that would be a wad. And those have different jobs within a shot shell. Those can be to protect the pellets, to keep them together as they travel, to provide some type of cushioning between those pellets and the powder. So they all have various purposes inside that shot shell.
Mr. Greer, did you bring with you some demonstrative items to kind of just demonstrate generically what you're talking about in a shot shell?
Yes, sir.
All right, can I see that real quick?
Yes, sir.
Handing back these to you.
All right.
Mr. Greer, if you would, beginning with the shot shells, you brought some demonstrative exhibits, is that correct?
That's correct.
If you would, just please hold them up, show them to the jury, and explain what it is we see when what we're looking at and what the components are in there.
Sure. Again, these are just two examples of a shot shell. Here you have a plastic body there of the shell with a metal head. On this end of it, that is the end that's going to be up against the breech face of the firearm. And in the middle, you'll see a small circle. That's the primer area, and that's what's going to be struck by a firing pin in a firearm so that it will fire. That's what's going to detonate inside the shot shell to cause it to be fired. Out this end, you see it's crimped on this end. This is the end that the projectiles or the pellets that are inside of this shot shell will exit and travel down the barrel of that shotgun.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Greer, the second firearm would be, if you would, talk about a little bit about what the AR platform is.
Sure. An AR platform is something that is commonly seen throughout America. Originally, it was designed by Armalite, and it's just a modular platform, and it's a rifle, a semi-automatic rifle in its normal state, and that's what we have here today. Okay.
And what would be the more common caliber that you might find on the AR platform?
Yes, sir. Typically, what is very common that we see in the laboratory and that you may be more familiar with is it's chambered in .223 Remington caliber, 5.56 NATO. That is a very common caliber for an AR-15 type firearm.
Okay. And what were some of the items that you examined in this case as far as rifle calibers?
In this case, I received one rifle, and it was chambered in .300 blackout caliber.
All right, explain to us what the .300 blackout round is and maybe how it's similar and different from a .556 round NATO.
Sure. Again, you may be familiar with the .223 Remington or 5.56 NATO caliber. The .300 blackout cartridge is sort of similar to that. When that was designed, it was designed so that it could be used with a lot of the original features of an AR-15. So the overall dimensions of those cartridges are very similar, with the exception of a shorter case length and a much heavier or larger bullet.
And .300 blackout being a relatively, at least compared to 5.56 NATO round, were some of the components interchangeable on the AR platform?
It's my understanding that when that .300 blackout caliber was developed, it was designed so that some of the components from the original AR-15 type that were chambered in the 5.56 NATO or the .223 Remington could be used with a .300 blackout.
And it is possible, maybe not ideal, but possible to use a magazine that would be formatted for the .223 5.56 round in a .300 blackout rifle.
Yes, sir, I would say it's possible.
And did you bring any .223 and 5.56 and .300 blackout rounds with you today for demonstrative purposes?
Yes, sir, I have two.
All right, would you please identify the two and tell us what we're looking at and what the similarities and differences would be?
Sure. To start off, this is an example of a .223 Remington. This is the one that you may be more familiar with. I will show you now. Side by side, this is the .300 blackout. And I'm trying to do this so you can see. You can see that their overall dimensions there are a little larger. Excuse me, about the same, with the exception of the larger bullet. And I'll give you a little bit of anatomy here of the cartridge. What we would refer to as this item right here is an unfired cartridge. Terminology in our firearms department is very key to us in being accurate in what we do. So we would refer to this as an unfired cartridge. That contains a bullet, which is this portion right here, this copper-colored projectile, and that's what's going to travel down the barrel of the firearm towards the target. Again, on this end, just like the shot shell, there's a primer there in the middle. You see the circle object there, and that's what the firing pin is going to strike, so that way it can detonate and cause the cartridge to be fired. When it's fired, we'll have a cartridge case, which is just the brass-colored portion here. And that is the cylindrical component there that holds it all together. It holds the primer, the bullet, and the gunpowder inside of it.
Thank you, Mr. Greer. For your permission to approach, just for demonstrative purposes, I'm going to put it on the helmet. Greer, if you would just pay attention, you have a little video screen there. Let's see if this will work. All right, Mr. Greer, can you see these two bullets on the screen?
Yes, sir, I can see that.
This is not going to work. All right, can you see them clearly?
Yes, sir, I can.
All right. What's the big black thing on the screen?
Appears to be a phone.
In your expertise, that's a thing. The two rounds we see there, the top round, can you identify which one that is?
The one that is up against the foam there would be the 300 blackout caliber cartridge.
And then, as you said before, the round below that would be the 223/556 round.
Yes, sir.
And seeing the actual projectile, meaning the item that exits the barrel of the rifle, would that be that tip, the cylindrical tip on the top?
Yes, sir. And I believe, if I remember correctly, both of those projectiles were copper in color, if you can distinguish that on the screen.
Okay.
Thank you.
And I don't know if you mentioned it, but I'll ask, as compared to each other, does the 300 blackout have a higher grain typically than the 556?
It's possible. The bullets come in different grain weights, so that is a much larger bullet, so I would expect it to be heavier.
And when we are going to hear about grain weights, could you explain what that means also?
Sure. Grain is a term that we use in firearms, and it's just a unit of measurement. So when we measure our projectiles, we are going to measure those in grains. And just as a common way to relate to that, if you imagine 7,000 grains, that's equivalent to approximately a pound.
Thank you. So measurements and bullets are done in grains, basically.
Yes, sir. That's what we refer to them.
Going back to shotgun shells very briefly, are there various types of shotgun shells and gauges or calibers?
Yes, sir, there are.
Could you explain a couple of the types that you might commonly find, and then just some of the calibers so we know what we're talking about?
Sure. Some of the more common gauges in shot shell, and gauge is just referring to the size and how we are able to determine what that firearm's chambered in. So a 12 gauge is something that's very common. That's a very common shotgun that I would expect to encounter. You may also have heard of or be familiar with a 20 gauge. That's another one that may be common, or 410 bore, which is a type of shot shell as well. Those are some of the more common ones that we would see in our laboratory setting and that you may be familiar with. Again, throughout those, there are all different kinds of shot shells loaded with different projectiles, loaded with birdshot, loaded with buckshot, and they all will serve a purpose within their own respect. But those can have multiple projectiles, hundreds of projectiles. It could have just one large projectile, which we refer to as a slug. So there's lots of options, if you will, within a shot shell.
And although this may be obvious, a buckshot is typically used to hunt what type of game?
I'm not hunting often, but I would expect a buckshot could be used for something, as it suggests, a buck. You would expect maybe a larger animal. Again, I'm not a hunter, but that's where I could imagine that.
Thank you, Mr. Greer. Before we move on, and speaking about the area of forensic science of firearm examinations, is that an area that is subject to peer review?
Yes, sir.
And could you explain to us what that means? What's the peer review process and why that's important in forensic science?
Sure. Within firearms and tool market examination, this is something that's been around for years. Firearms examiners have been learning about the firearms identification process, building studies and designs and experiments throughout many years. And as part of that process in designing those studies and doing this research within Firearm and Tool Mart, they're going to draft an experiment, conduct an experiment, publish an article on their findings, and during that process, there can be review, and there will be a review of the article of the experiment, where other scientists within our field, or other scientists or researchers can examine that and see what was going on during that process with it, and share their comments, and that's part of that peer review process. We, as an AFTE member, I have access to our AFTE journal, where a lot of those peer review articles are published, and they're able for other examiners to look at, for other scientists and researchers to look at, and help bolster their opinions and thoughts on firearms identification.
And personally, do you know how many exams you've conducted?
I do not have a number of examinations that I've conducted while at SLED. However, at this point, I would say it's somewhere in the thousands.
All right, Mr. Greer, I'm going to ask you, did you receive a volume of items concerning this case for review?
Yes, sir. I did receive several items to examine in this case.
And generally, did you have an opportunity, we're going to go through those items very shortly, but did you have an opportunity to, in general, review a significant amount of items for identification, possible identification?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And did you prepare a report after conducting these examinations?
Yes, sir. I did prepare a report.
All right, I'm going to ask us, if we would, go through a number of items very shortly. Do you have a copy of your report, and is it needed in order to refresh your memory and be able to specifically recall each individual item?
Yes, sir. I do have a copy, and I would appreciate being able to refer to it.
Okay, very good. And prior to your testimony today, have you had an opportunity to well, first of all, generally when items are submitted, do you know anything about the case?
Generally, when items are submitted to the SLED laboratory, I do not have information about the case. I do not.
Prior to today's testimony, have you familiarized yourself, at least very briefly, with the layout of the scene of the crime?
Yes, sir, I have.
And what, specifically paying attention to what on that crime scene layout?
I reviewed a crime scene layout in relation to where some of the marker numbers were that are listed in my report. Those just reference numbers, and I reviewed where those were in relation to the crime scene the evening where the two bodies were.
And is that just to assist us when we reference item number X, Y, or 1, 2, or 3? It allows us to then to testify as where that was located.
Yes, sir, it can.
All right, Agent Greer, I'm going to go down the list of items, and I'd like you to identify the item that was received for me, beginning with item numbers 2 through 5. Is slide item 2 through 5?
Yes, sir.
Your items 2 through 5? Did you conduct a review of that item?
Yes, sir. I did look at SLED items 2 through 5.
And while I find those items, if you would, please explain how you receive items in general, how you receive items in the lab, what the condition is before you review them, and then what you do ultimately with that item.
Correct. Yes, sir. So as items are submitted to the SLED laboratory, those can come from agencies all over the state, to include our own SLED crime scene department. Those items are given assignments for multiple departments depending on what the requesting agency is asking to have completed. We are a full-service laboratory, so sometimes the evidence has to travel through to other departments before it arrives to me in the firearms department. Typically, if you want something like latent prints or DNA to be processed on those items, it would go there first, because when I get the item, I may decontaminate it or touch it, and those prints or DNA may not be relevant anymore, because you would find me on it. Evidence travels throughout the laboratory to those departments and through our evidence control department. I receive those items either from those analysts or from our evidence control technicians. And when I receive that item and before I begin my examination, I want to make sure that the item is submitted to me in a manner that I can tell that it's not been tampered with. So we use a lot of heat-sealed pouches, so I'll make sure those are sealed, or our cardboard box that it's sealed up, and I can tell that there's either evidence tape or initials of that sealing examiner prior to me, so that way the evidence has been preserved in a manner that I know no one has altered with it.
And just so we're clear, thank you, Mr. Greer. Just so we're clear, when I refer to items, sometimes I'll say items 2. Does that refer to the items that you received them as a SLED designation?
Yes, sir. One other thing about the SLED laboratory, when evidence is submitted to the lab, it receives its own unique lab number that's specific to our laboratory, and it also receives new item numbers, and that's so we can track it throughout the laboratory, and our analysts throughout the lab can report and identify those clearly.
Thank you, Mr. Greer. I'm going to hand you what's been entered into evidence already as States Exhibits 63 through 68. And I believe they correlate to items 2 through 7 on your report. Would you please take a moment to look at these items and let me know if you're familiar with them?
When we receive these items, I do mark the packaging, and I'm also looking for my heat seal pouch, and this is how I package the evidence after I examined it. So I'm just confirming that I see some of the information on these items. Yes, sir. This appears to be what was submitted to the SLED laboratory as items 2 through 7 in your State's Exhibits 63 through 68.
Thank you. And did you have an opportunity, I'll take those from you. Did you have an opportunity to examine these items?
Yes, sir, I did.
And if you would, please tell us what your findings were for these items.
I determined that each of those items, they were all fired S&B heads.
Your Honor, I'm renewing my prior objection to the opinion testimony based upon the hearing we had, if it's for the record.
Yes, sir. You may continue.
I determined that each of those were one fired S&B head stamp 300 blackout caliber cartridge case, and that was items 2 through 7. That's what each of those items were.
Thank you, Mr. Greer. And the item on the screen in front of you would be what's marked as State's Exhibit 63. Is that representative of the collection of items that you reviewed in that batch?
Yes, sir.
All right. During your blackout round, were you able to see the head stamp on it? And I can give you back one of the items if you would. Were you able to identify the head stamp and who the manufacturer of that round was?
Yes, sir, I was.
All right. Who was that?
The manufacturer of items 2 through 7 was Cellier and Bellow, and you may hear that referred to as S&B.
300?
Yes, sir, and head stamp 300 blackout.
All right. Mr. Greer, I'm handing you what's been marked and entered into evidence already as State's Exhibits 33 and 34. Kim, do you want to see those? 33 and 34, which I believe correlate to 9 and 10 on your report. Would you please take a look at these items and let me know if you recognize them?
Yes, sir, I do.
Okay, and please tell us what they are.
SLED item 9, which is State's Exhibit 34, is a fired Federal Premium Double-Aught Buck 3-inch Magnum shot shell. And SLED item 10, which is State's Exhibit 33, is one fired Winchester Drylock number 2 12-gauge shot shell.
And after your review of the scene, where were items, your items 2 through 7 located?
After reviewing the crime scene diagram, I was aware of the marker numbers that those were recovered from, and then reviewing that diagram, it's my understanding that those items 2 through 7, the 300 blackout caliber cartridge cases, were located around or near the body of Margaret Murdaugh.
All right, and I'm referring now to your items 9 and 10, states 33 and 34. Where were those, after your review of the crime scene diagram, where were those identified and retrieved from?
Those appear to be in or around the storage room area near the kennels.
Thank you. I'm putting these two up on the screen. Mr. Greer, are these the items you just testified to having examined?
Yes, sir, they are.
Okay, thank you. Now, right now, we're identifying a number of items. Would it be fair to say that we're going to go over your results then at the conclusion of the identification?
Yes, sir, we can.
All right, referring to item States Exhibit number 4, your item number 22, would you please direct your attention to that?
Yes, sir.
All right, I'm handing you what's been marked. Jim. Handing you what's been marked as and entered into evidence as States Exhibit 4. Please take a look at this firearm. Let me know if you're familiar with it.
Ladies and gentlemen, this firearm is unloaded. It's safe for me to handle. I will keep it pointed in a safe direction here. I'm going to look for some of those identifying marks that I placed on this shotgun. Yes, sir, I do recognize this shotgun.
All right, tell us what that gun is.
This shotgun was determined to be one Benelli model Super Black Eagle 3 semi-automatic shotgun in 12 gauge with a serial number of U573210E17.
Thank you. Was there anything that accompanied States Exhibit number 4?
Yes, sir.
What were included with it?
Also submitted with that firearm was an accessory, which was the sling, and one unfired Federal Premium Double-Aught Buck 3-inch 12-gauge shot shell, and one unfired Winchester Super X Game Load 16-gauge shot shell.
Now, I think you just testified that 12 gauge, this shotgun is what gauge?
That is 12-gauge shotgun.
And I think you just mentioned that loaded in it was a 16 gauge. Could you explain what the process was ejecting? Is that the proper gauge for that shotgun?
No, sir. The unfired ammunition, as it was submitted to me, was received in another package. I did not remove it from that firearm. However, a 16 gauge would not be correct for use in that firearm.
Did you have to manually remove it from the shotgun?
It was already removed when I received it.
All right. I'm handing you what's been marked as states, and entered into evidence as States Exhibit 250, slide item 8. So item 8, slide item 8, but states item 250. Take a moment to review it and let me know if you are aware of what it is.
Yes, sir. I recognize this as sled item 8.
Did you have an opportunity to examine and review that item?
I did.
What did you determine it was or is?
Sled item 8, States Exhibit number 250, was determined to be one fired bullet, and that was listed as a near tire impression at marker 8.
And you were able to do further analysis, which will get you the results to determine its weight?
Yes, sir.
Very good. So as you testified before, this would be the bullet minus the casing that it originally came in. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. That is just one fired bullet.
And that's what it looks like when it doesn't have the back part on it?
Yes, sir. That's just a bullet without any cartridge case attached to it.
All right, Mr. Greer, I'm going to direct your attention to States Exhibit number 20, sled item 14. This is entered into evidence already. I'm going to hand it to you and ask if you conducted an exam of this item.
Yes, sir, I did.
All right, what were the results?
Sled item 14, which is States Exhibit 20, was determined to be 24 birdshot pellets, listed as from dog food storage room.
And can you repeat it for my purposes? These were pellets from what?
Yes, sir, 24 birdshot pellets, listed as from dog food storage room.
You testified before and you presented what a shotgun shell looks like. Would that be what's inside a shotgun shell ultimately?
Yes, sir, that would be an example of birdshot pellets that would be loaded into a shotgun shell.
All right, Mr. Greer, I'm going to direct your attention to what's been entered into evidence as States Exhibit 76, sled item number 12. You have an opportunity. Did you have an opportunity to review this item after you take a look at it?
Yes, sir.
All right, tell us what it is, please.
Sled item 12, States Exhibit 76, was determined to be one fired bullet, listed as from bedding inside doghouse.
I'm going to direct your attention to States Exhibit 102, sled item 11. Already entered in evidence. Please take a look at this item. Let me know if you're familiar with its contents.
Yes, sir. This is sled item 11, States Exhibit 102, and that was determined to be one fired bullet jacket fragment, 3 bullet jacket fragments, and 1 piece of lead, listed as defect in ground gravel, marker 13.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to refer to what's been identified as State's Exhibit 109. Sled item 137. Please review this item and let me know if you recognize it and if you performed an examination of it.
Yes, sir. This is sled item 137, State's Exhibit 109, and it was determined to be one piece of lead listed as from hair on the item 92 dress.
At this point, State would move for 109 to be admitted into evidence. Moving on to State's Exhibit 110, which is sled items 67 and 68. I'll direct your attention to that. They've been marked as, for identification purposes, as State's item 110.
No objection.
All right, Mr. Greer, I'm going to show you what's been admitted as evidence as 110. If you would, please take a look at it. Let me know if you've recognized it and performed an examination on it.
Yes, sir. State's Exhibit 110 represents two sled items. Sled item 67, which I examined, determined to be 48 birdshot pellets listed as from left shoulder and head of Paul Murdaugh at autopsy. And sled item 68 was one piece of plastic listed as from left shoulder and head of Paul Murdaugh at autopsy.
When you say where it's from, that's because that's what was identified on the item when it was submitted to you for review?
Yes, sir. That's solely based on how it was logged into our system by the submitting personnel.
Just some evidence now. All right, I'm going to recruit your attention now to three items, just to speed along the process a little bit. States 111, 112, and 113 marked as identification purposes. Sled items 69, 66, and 104. So if you please take a look at those in your items in your report, I'll be right with you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to break for lunch. We will resume in 1 hour and 15 minutes, 2:45.
All right.